I think this might be the most incredible day of my life, and I've always wanted to be at Comic-Con in Hall H as Spider-Man with all of you guys. It's always been a dream of mine. There is something that happens in those, I don't know what your experience was, but my experience, there's something that happens, there's something that happened with that experience for me where it was, story and character were actually not top of the priority list, ultimately.
Got it, yeah.
And I found that really tricky. I signed up to serve the story and to serve this incredible character that I've been dressing as since I was 3.
Yeah.
And then it gets compromised and it breaks my heart.
After the critical and commercial success of the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy, it's safe to say that Sony had big shoes to fill when it came to rebooting the series, a shadow they may or may not have overcome. This was mostly due to the way these films were developed, as Sony and director Mark Webb had fundamentally opposed visions that naturally collided. Although the Amazing Spider-Man series got off on a great start with a compelling plot and setting, things swiftly started to go downhill in the later installments as it became clear whose vision these films truly belonged to.
Avi was in charge the entire time. Avi knows all, right?
The Amazing Spider-Man films were viewed by Sony as more like a product than a genuine piece of art, neglecting the work and love put forth by the cast, crew, and most importantly, Andrew Garfield himself. Sony sacrificed these films in order to chase a trend and build up a cinematic universe. Due to this, The Amazing Spider-Man 3 and its subsequent spin-offs were prematurely cancelled, with a new rebooted version appearing only 2 years later. This is a story about creative interference, the clashing of visions, and the consequences of mishandling a beloved character. This is the story of The Amazing Spider-Man 3 and the mishandled potential of its cinematic universe. After the release of Spider-Man 3, Sony began work on a sequel, with the cast, crew, and Sam Raimi set to return. The film actually got pretty far into production, as many storyboards, 3D molds for the Vulture, and props were made for the film. However, eventually, Raimi and Sony would realize that they may not be able to meet their original release date, leading to countless delays in its production. Realizing that they won't get the film out on time, which meant that the rights would revert back to Marvel, Sony and Columbia would hire James Vanderbilt to write Spider-Man 5 and 6 during Spider-Man 4's production. At the time, it was reported that Spider-Man 5 and 6 would still be set within the Raimi universe. However, if Raimi did not return to direct, these 2 scripts would serve as a blueprint for a new franchise reboot. As we all know, Raimi would eventually drop out of Spider-Man 4 on January English,
motherfucker, do you speak it?
January 11th of 2010. Sony would pursue Mark Webb to adapt this script, which would be converted to a new origin story inspired by Ultimate Spider-Man. Webb had just come off his debut film, 500 Days of Summer, so the jump to a major blockbuster was a large undertaking. However, he saw it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that he just could not turn down. With the acquisition of a fresh new indie director, a talented selection of new cast members, and a seasoned production team, The Amazing Spider-Man was now set for filming and had the potential to be something truly special. Despite the more vibrant and stylistic approach to Webb's past films, The Amazing Spider-Man took on a more moody, dark, and gritty aesthetic and tone. This is because the first Amazing Spider-Man was directly influenced by the Dark Knight films, especially how they served as gritty reboots to their last films. The Amazing Spider-Man embraced a more dark and realistic approach to Spider-Man's mythos, and Mark Webb wanted to ground many aspects of Spider-Man's world. The spider suit was designed to appear as if a poor kid with barely any money put it together. The swinging has more weight to it, and the POV shots serve to make them feel more believable. The lizard was designed to feel more real world, and many of the stunts used practical effects to add to the believability. At its core, The Amazing Spider-Man is about a lonely boy who seeks relationships with others, a boy who's desperate for human connections, and through his many mistakes and triumphs, evolves into a true hero, but not at a price, still having to deal with the overbearing responsibility of his mantle and the sacrifices he'll have to make. Mark Webb's first Amazing Spider-Man is clearly a film created by a filmmaker with a unique and vivid vision. This was a film that wasn't grounded because they wanted to replicate the feel of the Dark Knight films, but because the groundedness of this film would help enhance the story, world, and characters. The filmmaker set out to create his own identity from the Raimi Spider-Man films, and he more or less succeeded in his mission. The Amazing Spider-Man opened to relatively positive reviews upon its release, and made a respectable sum at the box office, especially for a new franchise reboot. The best part about this film is Sony's lack of interference. It's true that many aspects of the film were likely altered or added in by Sony and producers. Many of the movie's crucial scenes meant to further add narrative substance or further develop characters and their arcs or cut out, leaving some characters to not be as fleshed out and fully realized as they could have been. Despite this, The Amazing Spider-Man was a pretty solid first entry and left an exciting future for where Mark Webb would take this new portrayal of Spider-Man.
What inspired you to build
an interconnecting Spider-Man cinematic universe using all his famous characters?
Money.
It's May 4th of 2012, and Marvel Studios releases The Avengers, a massive team-up film that was years in the making, bringing together all their past film characters into one gigantic crossover. Upon its release, Avengers forever changed how studios would approach franchise filmmaking. Cinematic universes were now a hot trend within Hollywood, and every major studio wanted a piece. Sony were among these studios that wanted a piece of the cinematic universe pie and would begin work on building their own universe using Spider-Man characters. On November 21st of 2013, Sony Pictures Entertainment chief Michael Linton would state that they had ambitions to create a universe of Spider-Man characters, and that Sony were currently developing a number of scripts for potential spin-offs. These spin-offs included a Venom film directed by Alex Kurtzman, a Sinister Six movie by Drew Goddard, a Black Cat and Silver Sable film, a female-centric team-up, and The Amazing Spider-Man 3 and 4. All these films were planned to create a continuous plot thread and story, with every film connecting to each other in some way, shape, or form. There were even some suggested films that were pitched to Sony, such as an Amazing Spider-Man 2 prequel film titled The Amazing Spider-Man Kraven, which would have featured the classic Spider-Man villain hunting down Spider-Man. However, in order to set up all these future spin-offs, Sony needed a film that would act as a branch-off point to all these potential movies. As a result, they would task Mark Webb with setting up all these films within The Amazing Spider-Man 2 before it began production.
But I wanted to make sure that we had the possibility of, there's so many things that are out there, and when you sort of detect the enthusiasm and what works in the universe down the road, you want to be able to draw from those things. And there are certain hints and inclinations and nuances that we did from the first movie that kind of came back in an interesting way in this one.
At its core, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 has a pretty compelling narrative, building upon everything the first film set up. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is also oozing with style. Mark Webb had a distinctive vision for this film, and every shot, every action scene, the visuals, the suit, and charming humor showcase a filmmaker who genuinely has a fantastic vision he wanted everyone to see. However, these elements, these genuinely compelling aspects of the film, are overshadowed by a clear corporate mandate to build up other films. the Sinister Six setup, Harry and Norman Osborn's role, the random plutonium subplot, and the conspiracy regarding Peter's father are all crammed into the film. This directly leads to The Amazing Spider-Man 2 being crammed with a series of storylines that serve to make the film as messy and incoherent as possible. The film seems to lack a genuine plot, jumping from one storyline to another at a swift pace. It doesn't help that many of the storylines were trimmed down instead of removed, making the many side plots feel incomplete. Andrew Garfield has stated how the story and characters were not the priority for Sony and how they messed with The Amazing Spider-Man 2 by cutting out many crucial scenes. Mark Webb attempted to salvage the film. However, despite his efforts, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was too far gone to be saved. Upon its release, the film received abysmal reviews, with critics calling the film directionless and messy. The film also grossed lower than the first film, making it the lowest grossing Spider-Man film to date. At this point, Sony was panicking, flabbergasted at the financial disappointment of this film. Spider-Man was their biggest IP, so the relative failure of this film acted as a sort of wake-up call for Sony on how they were handling this universe. As a result of The Amazing Spider-Man 2's reception, Sony would begin revamping their original plans. For one thing, The Amazing Spider-Man 3 would be delayed from its original 2016 release date to a 2018 release. Sony would still be developing their spin-offs, however, and would begin work on a new female ensemble film featuring many of Spider-Man's famous characters. On November 24th of 2014, Sony would be hacked, leaking many confidential emails to the public. Among these thousands of emails would also include detailed plans for their Spider-Man universe. You see, at the time, Sony had two potential directions they could take the Spider-Man universe. One was to continue developing their Spider-Man films with Mark Webb and the cast and crew returning. The second was to collaborate with Marvel Studios to work on a new Spider-Man reboot and bring him into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. As we all know, Sony ended up going with the second option, introducing Tom Holland's Spider-Man to the world. However, there's a possibility they could have went with the first option and continued to develop The Amazing Spider-Man 3. Midway through the production of The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Sony would begin work on the third film, bringing back Amazing Spider-Man 2 writers Alex Kurtzman, Roberto Orci, and Jeff Pinker. Now you should know that a script for the third film never publicly released. As a result, we have to rely on speculation, interviews, and rumors to piece together the story as good as possible. Based off interviews from Mark Webb, we know that the Sinister Six would have been featured as the film's antagonists. In a deleted scene from The Amazing Spider-Man 2, we learned that Oscorp somehow managed to revive the frozen head of Norman Osborn, and in the third film, he would proceed to become the leader of the Sinister Six and lead a personal war against Spider-Man. Sony had originally intended to release the Sinister Six film after The Amazing Spider-Man 3, but after The Amazing Spider-Man 2's disappointing release, they would delay the third film and push up the Sinister Six film for a 2016 release. This means that the Sinister Six would have already been set up before the third Spider-Man film, fleshing out these characters for the general audience. The Amazing Spider-Man 3 would have also explored elements regarding Peter Parker's guilt, as he would attend group counseling and meet Mary Jane Watson, who was cut from the second film to save time. Based off interviews from Mark Webb, we also know that there's a possibility the Venom symbiote could have appeared in the film, maybe attaching to Spider-Man and amplifying his anger and past guilt. There were plenty of other elements that would have been featured in the film. We know that Sony did intend to include Venom in this universe based off the fact that they were working on a spin-off film. There were plenty of other elements that would have played a part in the film, such as Peter's father and his dark connections to Oscorp. We also know that the studio was throwing around several ideas for potential plot elements. According to Dennis Leary, there was an idea that Peter would create a formula that could regenerate dead people in Peter's life, including Gwen Stacy, who possibly also transformed into Carnage and had a sexy battle with Spider-Man, according to an internal email from Sony.
Part of the discussion was that possibly in 3, there was this idea at one point that Spider-Man would be able to take this formula and regenerate the people in his life that had died. So there was this discussion about that Captain Stacy would come back even bigger in episode 3, and I was like, let's go.
Right.
There were a series of other pitches for the third film, such as Spider-Man teaming up with the Sinister Six to fight Venom. Despite these strange pitches from the studio, it's important to understand that these were simply ideas being thrown around. It's highly unlikely that Sony were actually serious about putting these in a film. The Amazing Spider-Man 3 never truly finished writing, so anything we know about the film is simply a mishmash of ideas that were being thrown around, developed, scrapped, and altered. Several months after the death of Gwen Stacy, Peter is encouraged to attend group counseling by his aunt. Peter agrees, and while there, he meets Mary Jane Watson, and the two of them begin to bond over their shared trauma. But Peter refuses to get close to her, fearing that he cannot open himself up to love someone like he did before. Peter also keeps in close contact with his father, who informs Peter of Oscorp's secrets and their intentions to supply advanced military weapons to hostile groups. Spider-Man, with this information, begins disrupting and destroying many of Oscorp's resources. Norman Osborn, angry of Spider-Man's interference, becomes the leader of the Sinister Six and wages war against Spider-Man. After fighting the group, Peter knows that he cannot take them on alone, and in his desperation, discovers and bonds with the Venom symbiote, an artificial life form created by Oscorp as both a cure for diseases, but also a dangerous weapon. Peter becomes intoxicated by its power and manages to effectively take on the Sinister Six, and manages to take out certain members of the group. Peter now realizes that the symbiote makes him more violent, irrational, and prone to reckless actions. It's almost like he isn't in control of his own body anymore. The symbiote even tortures Peter with visions of his past loved ones, reminding him of his failures, in an attempt to keep a tight hold on his mental state. With the help of Mary Jane Watson, Peter manages to rid himself of the symbiote, which manages to latch on to a new host, Eddie Brock, setting up his own solo film. With his newfound resolve and outlook on life, and with Mary Jane by his side, Peter faces the remaining members of the Sinister Six and manages to put them behind bars. It's important to know that this is simply just story speculation on my part. We have absolutely no idea what this film would have entailed, and there's a possibility it could have been much different and way more elaborate. In recent years, the Amazing Spider-Man series is remembered more fondly as fans try to look at the positives of the universe despite its flaws. And judging from the fan campaigns online, The Amazing Spider-Man 3 is a film fans would love to see if handled correctly.